The final complication for the graph drawing interface in the new results program is when you're getting into cost breakdown and you want to pick contributing resources for the allocated cost to a service. Now, this will really benefit from seeing the model first to understand what affects what, and also just to remind you how you would turn this functionality on, because it's not on by default. So, cost allocation is something that STEM does out of the box and always does, and it's a huge benefit that it does, because it does it automatically and holistically based on the relevant demand drivers and how much capacity each different driver requires. So if I look at a service like DSL Access here, it will report a total operating cost or operating charge that is the sum of all of the relevant costs that are allocated to it from resources that it drives directly, as well as other resources that it drives indirectly. So in fact, DSL Access will pick up costs not just from the ones it drives here, where it's responsible for all of those costs, but it will also pick up costs from, for example, the WiMAX network, where these costs can be passed through all the way back to the DSL Access. There are complications to do with whether you feed the cost all the way back through here, or whether you can use an intermediate service to act as a buffer and just represent all the costs below it, but that's off topic for this video. Here I just want to remind you how you turn the cost breakdown on. Oh, I'm sorry, didn't say it. The cost allocation, it always does, is the aggregate. What it doesn't do automatically is a breakdown of those costs, but you can turn it on. You go to the data menu, other details, and you go to cost breakdown. And in our model, if you just do transparent, it's the easiest thing. And when you do that, it then enables a pass-through where not only are the costs allocated, but the service retains a record of how much of the allocated cost comes from each of the resources that passes costs to it. And then the graphing challenge is that you can potentially draw a graph of each of those detailed cost allocations, and you need to be able to pick not just the service, but also the relevant resources. And in this video, we're going to see how that works. So having turned it on up here, I've set it to transparent, then I'm going to run my model through so I get the benefit. Include the working model, run all the scenarios. It's a small model, so it's still quite quick. And now when I draw the graph, draw new. So first of all, I'll pick some services. And actually, I've already done it. So I've already picked DSL Access and WiMAX Access. And I'm not using tablet replication, so there's nothing in the variance tab so far. I go across to cost allocation. I've just realized that probably should say cost breakdown. And to start with, nothing, they will all be available. And basically what it's showing me is, it's showing me orthogonally from the service names, it's showing the names of each of the resources which are either directly or indirectly driven by either of those services. So it's showing me the group of DSL resources up here. And via these elements here, it's then going through and it's also finding these other resources over here that are driven indirectly, all of these ones. And if I pick, for example, DSL shelf and WiMAX access sector, then just like the other tabs, what's implied is all the available combinations. So it would be for DSL access, each of those resources, for WiMAX access, each of those resources, and assuming that every element was connected to every other element, it would be 2 times 2 results. In fact, I happen to know that the WiMAX access service never touches DSL shelf, so I would expect that to actually only get 3 lines on the graph. And if I draw it, let's just check that. Indeed, there are only 3 lines, because whereas DSL access drives both resources, WiMAX access only drives one of them. Now, if I repeat that again, so on the cost allocation, at the moment I'm working with this orthogonally, but let me put this back over here. So by default, I just choose the resources independently from the services, but Rather like with the scenarios tab and the variance tab, I can check linear selection, and then it shows me all of the explicit combinations. So all the combinations for DSL access, of which you can see there are several, and then all of the combinations for WiMAX access, for which you can see there are fewer. So what I did before was essentially I picked WiMAX access sector and DSL shelf, and they both contribute to DSL access, but they only contribute to WiMAX access. And if you do it as a linear selection, that's explicit. On the other hand, if you pick something that they both drove, so if you were interested in base station site and WiMAX access sector, then both of them drive both services. But if you use the linear selection, it gives you the option to not necessarily have all the combinations, and you can then make a sparse selection like this. So that's the difference between doing it orthogonally, where you see just the resource names, and doing it as a linear selection, where you see the actual implied combinations. And there is a change from 7.4 here, because in STEM 7.4, actually we referred to the orthogonal selection as a 2D selection, because it was the services on one dimension and the resources in the other dimension, and you can simply turn it off. Whereas turning it off in 7.4 is actually what we're now turning on with a linear selection, where you turn linear selection on to see the explicit pairs, and we've called it linear selection here to make it consistent with linear selection for scenarios, linear selection for variance, and it's just for the sake of consistency. So linear selection is the less convenient to work with, it's the one you have to opt into having. Okay. Orthogonally, you have all the resources. You also have a thing called total, which means just the original total for the service, not with the breakdown. When you show it as a linear selection, you're seeing all the available pairs, and so total is then replaced with the actual service name. So service name by itself means this is the total for DSL access, as opposed to each of these being the components that make it up. Ditto, WiMAX access is the total. Here are the components that make it up. So, as you can see, with the linear selection, it's obvious that what you get here is filtered by only the services you've selected. And even as an orthogonal selection, what you see is a function of the elements you've selected. So these resources are all the resources that are driven by at least one of those services. If I go back to the elements, and if we consider that WiMAX access only drives the ones to the right-hand side of the model, it follows that if I take DSL access out and I'm only considering WiMAX access, then in the cost allocation tab or cost breakdown, I'll see fewer resources, because they're only these are the only resources that impact on WiMAX. So there is a filtering from left to right. What you pick in elements limits what you see in cost allocation, also in variance, and indeed also in results, in terms of which results are available. So with only WiMAX access selected, then under cost allocation you only see these resources, and if you're working with a linear selection, then you'll only see those pairs which correspond to that service. Obviously, the more services you add, the more, not only the more resources will be considered, but for each resource that is impacted, there's potentially going to be the combination for each different service. So it's very important to pick wisely at the start, so you don't end up with too many elements here. And that's without variance. If you've got replication as well, then it's going to get even more complicated, and it's so complicated that it doesn't actually quite work correctly at the moment. So I'm going to flip over to my PowerPoint, and basically just to explain, to try and attempt to explain this. So if you have got template replication, and let's say as well as a couple of services, you're considering a couple of variants for different sites, then in the cost allocation tab, if it's choosing orthogonally, all you'll ever see will be just the resource names and the total, because it will simply draw whichever combinations it finds of these elements, these variants, and these resources. If you turn linear selection on, then it has to show you all the actual pairs. And of course, with template replication, that's going to be a lot, because what you'll find is for a given service and a given site or variant for that service, then there will be the total result. Then there'll be the breakdown for the first resource at the first site, that same resource at the second site, and then another resource at the first site, another resource at the second site. And that's all still for just the first service at the first site. And then you'll have the same thing again for the same service at the second site, and so on and so forth. And the only thing which makes that slightly bounded is that most of the time, the most meaningful pairs when you've got replication will be that it will be a resource in the same template instance as a service that does the allocation. So most of the time you won't have the number of variants squared here, you'll only have the number of variants. But anyway, that's a bit complicated, and I'm not going to attempt to explain that in more detail in this video. Going back to the actual dialog, there are a few more options. So by default, it doesn't show you any allocations that are empty. So by default, the include empty allocations is not checked. If you check it, then what it will do is it will show you all the resources that potentially could be connected rather than the ones which just are. So if I go back to the orthogonal view, then these are the only resources which contribute to WiMAX access, and so these are the only ones that are shown. If you check include empty allocations, basically it's going to always show you every resource, and then you could draw a graph which has all those combinations, and if you subsequently change your model structure so that they are connected, then the numbers will show up. That's really just there for completeness. And the other option below, the temporarily disregard selection, is the same meaning as it has in several of the other tabs. It is that if you've made a complicated selection here of whichever pairs you want to have in the cost breakdown, if in fact you want to go back to just drawing totals for the service rather than this breakdown, but you don't want to lose the selection here, if you check temporarily disregard selection, it will behave as if you had selected nothing. So it temporarily ignores this, it behaves as if you've got nothing, and basically selecting nothing here is equivalent to selecting total, which basically means just the original total result for the service. And the reason we have that total item is so you can, if you want to, draw a graph which has the total and some or all of the individual resources. The only other option to mention quickly is that again, there is a separate graphs option here which allows you to choose whether the separate resources for this cost breakdown should appear all together on one chart or on separate graphs. And as in every other case, that's always initialized to be not checked, so that you have to explicitly opt in every time you want to get it to draw multiple graphs rather than just one. There's a lot going on in this particular tab, but it is absolutely the most complicated part of the whole thing, and it will probably be the last thing you'll ever actually need to use.